Do you know how much you shrink around the golf? Which for me, being 5'8", it's not great, unfortunately, but do you know how much you compress when you play golf, typically? If anyone gets this right, I'll give you a free system. About 2 inches, so about 5 centimeters. So you look at kind of first tee, 18th tee, there's normally about a 2-inch kind of compression through many people, especially more recreational and occasional players, so kind of weekend players typically. If you look at their kind of, call it what you want, nose to ball distance is a very crude reference on the first tee, that wonderful frame, and then typically, hopefully in pretty good position. But on the 18th tee, just how much fatigue and gravity kind of compresses the spine and what have you. So it's about a 2-inch compression we have. So I get the big advanced stuff. I actually had a discussion with a physio and a player on whatever day it was now, Tuesday, when I drove up to Heathrow from where I live in England. And the player's obsessed with level 10 stuff, big heavy squats, big deadlifts. I get that, throwing medicine balls, and that's Instagram, and I appreciate that, and you have to do that these days. But with great love for this young lady, she lives like this in a terrible, and I mean that in kindness, kind of position. So you kind of say to me, how will squats and deadlifts resolve that? But they like living in that very advanced, because it's the perception of distance these days and the perception of being good at golf is really just social media, which is really unhelpful in many ways. And I think it was quite evident we had with both Marcus and Camila yesterday that that initial move you're making backswing, which is great, and thank you, by the way, for bringing those two players yesterday. That initial move you make in backswing is just the body's way, in some ways, of trying to put itself back in the middle. And that was quite evident with Marcus, that he lives in that really adaptive position. So that kind of first move that he has is how he kind of shifts himself back to where he perceives the middle to be. And then secondly, with Camila in transition, the minute you really kind of put your foot down pretty hard in transition, which we'll talk about obviously today with some of the distance-based questions, and really expose that body to huge amounts of force and huge amounts of load, you'll typically always deform towards that dominant posture that you have. I have a really bad right shoulder just through life and events and what have you. My shoulder likes to live in this position. I have to keep reminding myself to pull it back. So it's the one reason why that when I try to hit it hard, as you and I were discussing kind of off camera then, I always get pulled into this position, and it just drives me insane. That conceptually I can do it, I can actually move that way well through active thought. But the minute I really kind of go fast in transition, despite all my best intent, which is what we'll go through this morning, it still reverts and moves in that direction. So that's why I think postures and frames that we discussed at great length yesterday morning is still probably the main priority. That we get someone in that wonderful wide rib cage, long neck, kind of good feet. It's remarkable that it resolves, and also equally, when you kind of invert that again, it's also remarkable the issues it also creates. So if you're going to do one thing well, which I hope was the basis of yesterday, just stand well. So even kind of in a playful way, just kind of reference, if you can now, kind of how you're sitting this morning, and then reference it around about 3:30 this afternoon, and I'll be curious to see if everyone's in that lovely, or they're completely tired and what have you. Is everyone kind of happy with that concept? And you've got those references that we can use to really, when you're at the club, and I'm into this in a big way, this is great, nice having this stuff. Obviously Hank has the system, so it's fantastic having that here. And even this applies to me kind of more than most people. So I'm very much into, if it's just you on your own with the player, how could you help them with nothing apart from discussion, mirrors, that kind of stuff. It's wonderful having this, and we're very lucky to have it. So it's having that long neck, kind of nose forwards, the idea being whatever height you are, be an inch taller. Lovely kind of wide rib cage and kind of tripod feet. Yeah, I think from there, good luck trying to mess things up, really. It's actually quite a challenge to kind of actually move quite poorly from that kind of position. Okay, so I keep forgetting your name, and do apologize. Sorry? Asked me a great question around if I observed anybody that is dominant in, say, left or right-handed just through life, that then is there a connection back to golf? And if there is, I've just yet to look at it, is the honest answer. The bits I do know about kind of left and right-handed people often connects back to things like, here he is, good morning. Just been talking about you, Matty. We did? No? No, we did. I said it's actually remarkable when only one person doesn't come back on day 2. So it was Mate, and I didn't realize you're some kind of hero in Finland. I already established that last night. You're some kind of national hero figure in Finland. I didn't realize that. Well, I was hoping you'd tell me that for your past experiences in life. And I need to be nice to you next time, and kind of when he walks in. But what I do know about left and right-handed people is that you could be really going into some deep biology now. A lot of it even goes back to the position you grow in actually in the womb, believe it or not. There's a lot of evidence in science that connects back to just the orientation, the position you're in when you develop inside the womb, actually whether you then become left or right-handed. And because most fetuses develop in a similar position, it relates back to why we're so dominant through our right side in people. But a lot of it just connects back to who you first observe on day 1. I know Spieth and Mickelson we discussed. They're both, so Mickelson's a right-handed thrower, but a left-handed golfer, and Spieth is the opposite. So if you're watching that kind of mum, dad, brother, sister, dominant figure perhaps on day 1, you kind of mirror what they do. I was interested in my daughter, loves kicking balls, and she only ever wants to kick current with her left foot because she's kind of watching dad kick it this way, so to her that's her left foot kicking. You go to Canada, probably the highest proportion, and maybe even the same in Finland perhaps, with ice hockey in Finland, or is it more in Sweden? Yeah. With the amount of left-handed hockey players in Canada, they have the highest proportionate rate of left-handed golfers. So I think a lot of it is observation. A lot of it is just kind of who you're around on day 1. It's very much still the approach monkey see, monkey do. I think for many of us we copy. But there will be some neurological science as well that goes back to even to how you develop in the womb, the position you're in. So it's an area I've not really looked at, but it's certainly one I'll put on my list of things to do. So, and look at that stuff. But any questions on yesterday before we move into today? And I'm surprised no one sat on the floor. I think there's still chairs in the room, which is chairs and shoes. My great dislikes in life. Anyway, so today we're going to look at really some different areas. So I think it's every year has its thing. And like we kind of discussed yesterday in some ways, that this year is just about distance. It's almost an obsession in golf, that just how hard can you hit it and how far can it go, and it's almost forget the rest of it. If you kind of just blast it miles, then that's a good thing, which it is. Obviously distance is clearly helpful. We know that from things like ShotLink in strokes gained, and you look at the best players in the world on both men's and ladies tours, typically they are the most powerful players, but there's a lot more to it than just obviously hitting the ball a long way. You go back to last year, it was all about ground reaction force. The year before that, all about club delivery data. The year before that, things like kinematic sequences. So every year seems to have its thing in golf. So it's kind of like you and I said, David. In some ways, it's kind of fashion over function. In some ways, it's forget the good stuff. Let's just do this. But that's just where we're at, I guess, is a race at the moment within golf. But the great thing is we can really now start to accurately establish and understand quite clearly what the best players do to produce speed these days. And there's nothing you can do through coaching. All of the areas we'll go through this morning. Again, how can you kind of coach these movements if it's just you and I, for example, and then it's no force plates, no motion capture systems, no launch monitors, just kind of how can you coach this? So it goes through a little bit like we did yesterday with the when we looked at how the segments move anatomically, how you can actually kind of look at distance. And I'll show you a nice case study of actually 2 players I saw recently, just before the lockdown happened back home. A guy who's 7 irons, 100 and something, so a pretty powerful player, and a similar kind of age group player who's 7 irons, kind of mid-70s. Similar age, similar kind of, the short guy is actually a lot taller, which we'll come on to in a second. So he should have mechanical advantage because he's got much longer arms, but there's a 25, 6 mile an hour difference in their 7 irons, despite looking at them and going, they're pretty similar in their shape. So we'll look at some distance-based stuff today. And then an area which really came up, I think, quite in a fun way with Camilla and Marcus yesterday afternoon. Really, how do we now learn movement? Even some of the play we had with the words they were using, which was quite fun. Certainly for me it was anyway. But actually, how do you learn? Which kind of connects back to your question. and actually start to define what coaching is. So most of us, obviously, Mate and from physiotherapy, but even then, that's a form of coaching. Most of the audience are coaches, but can anyone actually define what coaching is? If I said very quickly, kind of pop your hand up, you don't have to, by the way. Tell me exactly what coaching is. What is a coach? And most of us go, oh, yeah. But it's something we do every day, but yet we don't really understand fully actually what coaching is. We'll actually look at really what your main role is within coaching. And I hope it's actually very straightforward as far as you just have to do X is really what coaching really is. So it's actually hopefully quite a short answer on that one. And then I think just to kind of really thread the 2 mornings together, or 2 days together then, really just go through things to avoid. So really connecting back to some of the pain-based stuff that you may experience perhaps in some of the live sessions. Typically movements that can happen. And I know UC was very kind of big on me including this because of really what we observed and what we saw back in the national camp sessions earlier this year in March. So why guys have some pain and why is it so? Becoming now more relevant perhaps in some of the more younger kind of developing players. Happy with that? Because I really have no plan B, so open a go, Ray. Cool. Right. Let's do it this way. It might actually work. Let's do it like this. So as far as gaining length, and I've kind of put these from kind of point 2 down to kind of point 7, or probably from point 3 down to point 7. In no particular order, it was just the order my mind recorded them in. But kind of points 1 and 2 are probably still the most important too. So the order they're listed in there, the first and second ones are the most influential considerations on distance. But kind of points kind of 3 down to 7 are just because I put them in that order for no reason. So when we look at kind of club head speed in some ways, it's like the kind of the commercial value, like the acceptable face in some ways of distance. I produced whatever distance, 90 miles an hour over 6 iron. Great. Why? So what have you actually done to get that kind of very commercial value on, say, launch monitor, this is my club speed, brilliant. But do you know how you produced it? So rather than just saying, I want to gain length, hit it harder, which is an approach, and actually can be quite a useful approach still, which we'll come on to as we move more through the kind of practical side of this. Actually, what have you done to produce that value? So to really see a gain in, say, club head speed, we really have to do what? And even going back to what you and I were discussing there, that when you look at all the questions you get asked in golf, how do I improve how I move? How do I avoid pain? Pain, which we'll come on to later on, can be a lifetime to understand. I know why my shoulder aches, but I've yet to resolve it. And that's a 15-year kind of discovery I've been on. So I really now know, it goes back to my wisdom teeth, is the real answer to why my shoulder aches. But no one's ever yet fully resolved it because it's so deeply embedded in my movement system, it's just very hard to move away from. So of all the questions you get asked, pain is actually quite a hard one to really accurately resolve for players, to really understand it. Improving how they move, not that challenging, but to actually gain length, typically 3 balls. It's probably the easiest thing to ever do when you understand what produces distance. But it's been sold so well online, how to gain distance, and this guy's gained 10 miles an hour. It's like, if you actually look at how to gain length, it really is very, very, very easy. It's 3 balls. Still, say easy is the wrong word to use, but the most realistic way of gaining length, just swing it back faster. Still the easiest way to gain distance. So do you know why a faster backswing will hit it further for you? You just apply more force to the handle in transitions. You have to slow it down harder. So the braking force you apply to go from back to downswing has to be so much harder, which connects back to the point we'll come on to in a second. You just apply a lot more force to the club. So if you want to have something gain length, just swing it back quicker. And you'll see a very notable, at least I hope so, very evident gain in distance pretty quickly. So for all the wonderful signs, just think about faster. You'll gain distance because you have to then apply a lot more force to the club to really change direction from back to downswing. Which then really comes onto that kind of first point that you look at recent research, and this is pretty credible research. It's something like 92% of club head speed variability. So I would say player A, as we'll come on to in a second, produce a value of 100 miles an hour with 7-iron, and player B would produce, say, 77, whatever it might be. I can't remember exactly, but 70-something. The single biggest influence is how much force is being applied along the hand path. So essentially the path the hands move on in downswing, so the path that the hands approach or swing down from top to impact, how much force you apply along that hand path is what controls distance. So in many ways, how much force the hands apply to the grip as the grip moves along that path into downswing. That equates to over 90% of distance. So the question then becomes, how do we then increase force to the handle? And we'll actually do this when we stand up in a second. It's going to be not as much stand up, sit down today, so hopefully that might be a little easier for you. So we'll look at then how can we just apply more force to the handle. But I want to just kind of show you some examples of what typically values, and it'd be interesting, David, with your player that comes this afternoon, just kind of what kind of values they produce based on kind of what we now know. The real big dogs, both in ladies and men's game, actually do produce. So it then opens up the question, are they as long as they could be? And that's a fun place to be in life. So I'll just kind of look at this, and we'll put it in, just drag these plots up. I know how much coaches often dislike data, so apologies, guys, for showing too much data today. I hope with the lighting, yeah, you can kind of see that just at the bottom, so we'll do it over here because it's easier. The kind of bottom value here, so that's the peak force. How much strain, how much load, how much force are the hands placing into the handle? Pretty much around about, so the peak force of the hands typically is around about here in downswing. Ironically, it goes back to those, again, what you and I were discussing there. It's pretty much at that point again in time where the elbow's beneath the shoulder. So we start to see these lovely connections, at least I hope in many ways you'll see these nice threads that kind of run through kind of what we discussed yesterday to what we discussed today, that why is that reference to me such a really good movement reference of the elbow beneath the shoulder. Equally so, it's pretty much, and I'll actually show you this in a second so you can see it live rather than just believe in me. It's pretty much that point in time where the elbow is beneath the shoulders when the hands apply peak force to the handle. It's very hard applying peak forces in these positions. So when that kind of arm hangs downwards, it goes back to the idea of connection rather than compression. As I know you and I obviously discussed it a little bit detail with the guys yesterday. Can you actually see those numbers? They're just numbers, and we're talking about this more this afternoon. So the play on the right-hand side, 70, I think it's 77 or 76, I can't remember, but it's certainly mid to high 70s. You know, less than 50 kilos of force on the handle, pretty low. And then the player next to him, almost twice the amount of force to the handle, 105 kilograms. That's a lot of load being applied to that club through that handle in transition. So we then start to understand, okay, why do we get these club speed numbers? Well, it comes back to how much force, how much load can you put into that grip? So how can we do that in a very, very playful way? Just everybody stand up, but it'd be nice to do it as a group. This we can all measure now. It was great to have this information. And it's just ironic. It really connects back to, for me, that elbow is such an important reference. Still one of the ways of playing with this. And I appreciate without a club in hands, it's going to be a little challenging, but we can still play with this stuff. And give yourself enough space just so you can kind of make a few swings and kind of play with some concepts. There's kind of different ways of doing this. And the great thing about, very good by the way, the great thing about this is actually many, many ways of kind of achieving this movement. But we'll kind of share some examples today, and then we'll kind of let you be at a slightly more playful approach with this. So essentially, it's almost can you kind of pour the hands in opposite directions? How much can you separate the kind of left and right hand as you start downswing? A slightly more intuitive approach is, can you almost pull the grip off the shaft as you start down? So when we start in downswing, how much can we actually pull the grip and pull the handle off the shaft? So almost just start to conceptualize that yourself as we're doing this. As I start down, how much can I pull that grip away from that shaft? Just play with it. Just do a few swings and just kind of internalize that for a couple. How much can I pull that grip off the shaft? I know Hank's got a bad arm, bless him, so yeah. I think you still produce more force in that play. I know that was pretty low there. I haven't seen one that low since I looked at my data last. So very much the idea in transition, rip the grip off the handle, off the shaft. So almost leave the club head behind, pull the grip away from you. It kind of goes back in some ways to kind of what we discussed yesterday around, you can stand up for a bit. We've had a lot of time sitting down. It kind of goes back to our discussion around the X factor yesterday, that when we look at the rotational, the side of the X factor, it really comes back to the separation that happens really above the diaphragm. So going back to some more of the movement-based stuff we discussed yesterday, how much can we separate pretty much from here and upwards? So the idea of the lumbar spine and pelvis moving independently of the upper rib cage, not the pelvis and rib cage, which is a very, very different approach. When you look at the X factor, which we'll come on to a little bit later on, there's also a lateral separation, which we also have to include. So there can be a tremendous tissue, muscle stretch without any rotational separation when the pelvis glides laterally. So that still creates, although there's no rotational separation, which is often how it's been discussed and shared within golf in recent years, how much can you rotate the pelvis and the rib cage independently? The actual initial separation, when we look at how the pelvis and rib cage interact in transit, very good. You're absolutely right. It's how the pelvis glides and shifts before it rotates as we start down. That also creates a tremendous stretch through all those tissues in our body, which then connects back to some of those X factor values. So another way you can kind of play with this is how much lateral separation. Everyone know the old kind of John Travolta dances? Not like I can dance, but it's kind of that kind of movement. How much can we get that lateral separation between the hands and the pelvis in transition? So in the idea of frontal plane or side-to-side movement, just start to play with this. How much can you laterally separate the pelvis and the hands as you start down, just in a playful way? So can we create a lateral separation? And Hank can definitely dance. Now I know why. There's a bigger story to why he broke his arm, I think, than he's told me so far was at Henrique's party. And there's a story developing now. And we actually may even come on to, does anyone feel a bit of activity in that lead shoulder when they do that? I'll come back to this great concept of adduction, which has had a lot of attention online in the last kind of year. Get this, it's actually the lateral separation which creates the stretch around that lead shoulder. So when we often see some of this stuff, as we'll come on to in a second, it's that lateral separation. You can sit down, so thank you for that, by the way. You have or you haven't, or? On. Well, this is kind of this could look like my definition of dancing is this, so I'm from a very remote part of England. We don't dance. Not sober anyway. So when you look at, say, the handle forces, we know handle force is what creates distance. That's the biggest contribution. How can we increase that? For example, can you pull the grip away from the shaft in transition? Or can you get the hands and pelvis to laterally separate in transition, which is actually a huge part of that kind of X factor story in some ways. So it's still the single biggest influence on distance, kind of improving force. And it'd be interesting, perhaps with David's guy later on in a playful way, depending on what values they produce and how they produce distance, that can we even increase that for him through exploring areas such as this. Is everyone kind of happy with that as a concept? And Pretty clear? Cool. Okay, the next one is the kind of makes up, we got this kind of missing 8% now and around the distance. Probably the second biggest influence is essentially just the length of the hand path. How long is the actual three-dimensional hand path? And we have all these values in the system, which we'll show you shortly. The irony on these two players is the player with a very short distance actually has a much longer hand path. They have much longer arms. So they actually can produce a much longer three-dimensional path just because they chose their parents differently, really, is the answer behind that. So it really shows how good they could become if they move well. So they're very, very poor despite what they have. So when we look at the length of hand pass, again, it really goes back to Camellia yesterday in a nice way, that why I'm so, going back to our question, where do I start with data, in which we'll come on to a bit more as we move through the day. Still, for me, like I said, yes, I think that the biggest influence on how we move in golf is the neck. You could debate and discuss that, but the neck's still kind of, I think if you had 100 guys in the room, the majority would probably say the neck really is the most important segment on rotation. Foot and ankle is very important as well. But the most important segment on how we move in the golf swing is that trail arm, because of what we discussed yesterday. All the behavior changes, all the movement changes happen here first in swing. So it really goes back to what we discussed with Camellia, so those kind of 4 reference points of still possibly, again, I don't like using the word easy because it's not easy, but the most realistic way of increasing that width and that hand path is still using those references of, so I hope you can all see, elbow to shoulder, elbow to shoulder, elbow to shoulder. Typically, anytime the elbow goes behind the shoulder joint, the hand path will narrow. So it's a huge reducer and a huge constraint on distance. So you look at it also from an anatomical observation. I mean, that right arm for me really is, if I was really, look, just do one thing. You can do anything you want, but you've got to do just one thing well, but still for me have that trail arm move well. Because it pretty much connects back to most things we see in pain, neck. Get the idea of pelvis thrust. We discussed at pretty good length yesterday. That the idea of the pelvis thrust often connects back to the GPS going, how do I get there from there? A lot of wrist and neck and elbow-based issues. The play we discussed yesterday with his foot actually went back to his neck and his shoulder. So from an actual golf swing understanding, for me that right arm or trail arm is still pretty much the important segment. So one of the nicer ways, and let's just kind of stand up and kind of remind ourselves of that reference again. So if everyone can just stand once again. Some consider this exercise, Hank, sit down, stand up. They're like, should have. I'll let you guys write your notes. You take your time, it's all good. So just explore in your own little, what it means to you, which we'll come on to a lot later on. Just start to play with those references. Now, ideally, like we had with Camellia yesterday, mirrors, I think, can be quite helpful. Just play with that mirror of elbow to shoulder, elbow to shoulder, elbow, elbow. You can even extend on from there, even halfway through. Just start to play with that kind of trail arm, shoulder reference. This is practice for me doing it twice. So this is so using that mirror, kind of elbow on the shoulder, and then kind of elbow beneath shoulder, elbow to shoulder. Did I pass or? Thank you, boys. But I mean, I actually watched the Masters at the weekend. First golf I've watched all year, just because it's the year we've had. And it's interesting still that, typically when you see errors in these players or big misses, I try and watch golf with the commentary on mute. But most of it still connects back to me and really getting to kind of adaptive positions through that trail arm still. So it's still probably the most important segment on movement. So from a hand path length, I mean, just again, let's kind of do a complete walkthrough now. And very much like, say, Camellia yesterday, because she was such a wonderful example to use. Just start to move and transition with the elbow moving behind you, and just start to reference, if you can, how that hand path narrows. So if you can all just play with those. So in that first movement transition, when the elbow goes behind you, how the hand path will narrow in transition. So again, just let's kind of remind ourselves This is about distance. You can sit down now, by the way. Thank you for that. This is about length. We're discussing distance currently, not club delivery and golf coaching, which it is in some ways. How do we gain length? Because it seems to be that the global golf obsession currently, that how far I've hit it. So when the elbow goes behind you, the hand path narrows, the length of the hand path clearly connects back to distance. So the irony was I can show these values we have in here, and it was kind of fun reviewing this when I reviewed it earlier this morning. Apologies for the data you'll see on screen now. Whoops. The little bottom right-hand value by my cursor for the short player is the only one where they're actually lower, but this person's 6'2", big long arms, so they should, through just lever length, produce a longer hand path, but it really shows how good they could become. So it's the only one where this player was actually a little lower, but because he was actually more kind of my height. I think by close of this, Hank, these guys would be drug tested next session. These guys have just gone a long way. Okay. Let me just look at one thing here. Sorry guys, my computer's gone a little slow, so apologies for this. Okay. Right. So the next one we can then look at is really kind of how the pelvis moves. I know Dave and I were discussing this briefly at kind of lunch yesterday around one of the biggest predictors or references of really how well, I mean, it's one of those phrases which has just appeared. You've got to use the ground well. Okay, that's good. So can someone expand on what that means to me? Because it's been one of these phrases which have kind of got really connected in golf now. One of the real predictors we can really see within movement is to how well someone really kind of applies that kind of downforce, how well they extend and really compress through that lead ankle, that lead hip, up into the rib cage and whatever. So that whole system really, like we discussed with the feet yesterday, the idea of the big toe. It's how well that big toe interacts with the ground really is that our jumping joint is very hard to jump as we established yesterday with our toes off the floor because we've lost the ability to really compress through that big toe. So that big toe is still a really important segment on really how well the pelvis can elevate and move up through impact. So the more the pelvis elevates through impact, the more of a predictor it can be for how well we're pushing downwards and vice versa, then how well we're being extended back upwards. So you can kind of look at that two ways because there's kind of an add-on to this. So one of the real, again, when looking at players, how well they're really kind of compressing downwards is really how much is that pelvis elevated or elevating as it approaches impact relative to its start position. So how up is the pelvis relative to that start position? Secondly, how quickly does it come up? So how fast is that pelvis movement upwards through impact? So the more the pelvis comes up, normally represents the more that we as the human have pushed downwards. When you start to see some of the values that these guys can produce, I'm going to show it almost in kind of plot format first. Again, apologies for showing plots. I know how much this drives people insane. And so I will go through this very quickly. On the left-hand side, we have the player, the very powerful player. On the right-hand side, we have the less powerful player. So the blue plot is the up and down of the pelvis. So just the kind of up and down movement the pelvis goes on as it rotates. And we've got those kind of four vertical lines, address, top, impact, and finish. So when the blue plot is above the 0 horizontal line, it's elevated or higher than its start position. So start position is where it starts. So hopefully what you can see there quite clearly is on the right-hand side, it's a bit of a kind of a wavy line, a bit kind of reluctant to go up. Doesn't really go up really that much at impact relative to its start position. So as far as how that left hip's moving through impact, how it kind of stays down perhaps. The pelvis is quite level. Other ways you can see this. The left knee perhaps gets kind of a long way outside the left hip and the left ankle. So just to kind of show you guys, it gets a bit kind of, the hip gets compressed downwards. You often lose that connection through that big toe quite early. I have on video, I'll actually show this person moving. I'm pretty sure I've got their footage. So if you can give me 30 seconds, I'll actually show you a live example of this, if that would be helpful for you. As in the very kind of short hitter. Whereas on the left-hand side, an immediate spike in transition, way higher than its start position. How can that look within, say, that the movement would, how much that lead side elevates immediately in transition, while still keeping that connection to that big toe. So just kind of stand up for me again. Stand up, sit down. Again, just start to play with this, that in transition, keeping that connection, really pushing through that big toe. How much can you elevate that lead side of that pelvis? Very good, ladies, good. So really push through that big toe, extend through that lead hip. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah, very good. So more for the lead hip, Mate. Get it going up more. Yeah, you're kind of Finnish royalty. I didn't realize that. So I've been in this man's car and didn't know that. I need to be polite next time. Very good. But in many ways, it then really goes back to, some of the stuff that Mate and the physios will do with you. Is there something through that system that doesn't let that wonderful, that extension through foot and ankle, knee and hip, up into that spine or what have you? If you can just give me actually a couple of seconds, let me just find on my computer. I'll show you the poor mover. It might just be a helpful way if you've seen it. So apologies for dropping in and out of this 1 second. Make sure the sound is off. Great. This was actually the player in question, so I was kind of videoing their feet that day. And you'll see how early they lose that connection through that big toe. I'll play it so you can actually watch it in a second. So how much that knee gets outside the left hip, which then really, good luck trying to jump or elevate from that position. That really would be quite an achievement. So let me kind of play it. So I don't know if it will play, but hopefully it will do. Should do. I don't know why it's not. Now they've lost that connection already. The club's not even visible yet. The reason it's slow is actually me doing a narration to this, so give it a few seconds, it will play on. They've already lost that connection in transition around that lead toe. Here we go. How that right foot then moves that way. So remember, go back to about the feet, the line of force in the foot. Anatomically is that long, big toe. So imagine these are feet again. Everyone kind of pushed their thumbs up. Got that kind of long bone, the metatarsals is called in the foot, that as we rotate anti-clockwise as it would be for right-handed players, how we move that pressure on that right long big toe to then push up through that big big toe on his left foot. Equally, look at his right foot. The ankle is almost outside of his big toe. I mean, play with this. I mean, let's experience this. I mean, it goes back to yesterday. What's more important, experience or intellect? Knowledge and know-how. Let's experience it now. Just stand up for me, ladies and gents, once again. Just move that way in transition. Again, just as you start down, let the ankle of the right foot so move outside the toe and lose that connection through that big toe. Then try and kind of really get that pelvis moving and elevating from that position. Hopefully it feels a bit kind of Not so nice, ladies? That's actually me. I'm not that good. Different chaps, a little harder to move well. When the right ankle goes outside, you lose that connection. I mean, actually start to see these connections now. When you move that way equally, just start to see how it can also connect back to that right elbow getting behind you. Yeah, pretty much that, yeah. Oh, George is a good friend of mine. George and I are actually great mates, so George is not, the Instagram perception of George is very, very different to George. George is actually a really cool man, so him and I speak a lot. He's actually a good guy. But I wouldn't get too distracted by Instagram with George. He's a good one. But you just start to see these little threads now, the elbow behind. Yeah, good luck producing distance for those. Thank you, brother. I knew I had it somewhere. So, and I can, again, I was saying to the guys yesterday, Hank, that everything we display, they can have. This is completely not sensitive. It's all been face removed. So there's nothing here that I won't share with the high group today. To then give you an idea of how hard these guys push up. And again, go back to you, David, so apologies to keep referencing you today. It's not so much how much the pelvis elevates, it's actually how quickly it moves upwards. They give you an idea of the kind of values. See the second one up? It's not easy being 5'8", but it says rate of elevation. Again, we'll reference these when we look at players later on. Less than 10. That's almost 0. But how quickly, David, it can get into the 50s. The real big dogs. So really how explosive they are. Really, it goes up, and it goes up very quickly. Essentially, how high can you jump? How high can you jump? It's interesting, when I was in the US, I knew nothing about basketball, nothing at all. It's just not a game that I was ever around as a kid. I really learned to massively appreciate very quickly how good athletes, basketball players are. I learned, wow, these guys are very impressive. And that established very quickly when I was living in America. And it's interesting, almost every basketball player I had the fortunate pleasure of being around was off the scale good at this. Off this, because of all just that jumping as a kid still. So it kind of goes back to Matt. I mean, still when we look at movement, still the ability to jump well. It's still a wonderful reference that we can use to really look at how elastic that system is, how spring-like are we as a human, really go back to jumping. So again, you can start to look at these threads now. If you can stand well, walk well, and jump, yeah, what more do you need, really? Yeah. Yeah, still very good. Above 25 would be, that competes, yeah. That competes. Yeah. Yeah, that guy was just, you would go, it can't be right, I need to do another capture. It's the same again. Wow, okay, it's right. But yeah, but I mean, again, it really shows maybe this guy get even longer this afternoon, So you start looking at kind of good movers for golf. If you can stand well, walk well. We mentioned yesterday the two best walkers, DJ and Rory. There's a theme there. They all set the ball a long way. And just good jumpers. Real good kind of forward jumps, like long jumps and triple jumps, and obviously high jumpers, basketball. Great to play. Great to play. Let's just do one more, and we'll have a little 2-minute break then for you then. Okay, that really then comes on to, I kind of mentioned that little word a few times, the elasticity of movement, which is kind of my kind of big thing. And much of my PhD many years ago was all about elastic movement. How elastic are we as humans? We are elastic systems. You want to get into real precise, really look at powerful players. It's really how well they move their fluid through their system. To be very into some deeper physiology, it really connects back to how quickly you move water through your body. So it's interesting with Cameron Champ. Probably up until Bryson made all those adjustments this year, the longest player in the US Tour, but the lowest, very low ground reaction force data on every direction. So you look at his ground reaction force data, like you were saying there, David, you look at him and go, he's actually quite low, but he's the longest driver in the US until certainly, I think Bryson has done what he's done this year. He just moves fluid through a system so quickly. We talked about those internal pressures yesterday. How will you really create pressure through your system? I mean, off the scale good. So then you look at how valid and reliable is ground data. I'll let you answer that one. So when you look at these stretch shortening cycles, the X factors as it's being called, the separations, they essentially happen across every single joint in the human body. The foot to the lower limb, the shin, the calf. The big femur to the hip joint, the pelvis to the rib cage, the lead arm to the rib cage to the lead shoulder, the shoulder to the hand. Every single paired segment goes through this wonderful kind of separation, closure kind of cycle through the whole body. It's just golf only really knew until recently. They looked at pelvis and rib cage, but those stretch shortening cycles, those separations happen in every single joint. How my foot moves against my tibia and fibia, how the big femur interacts with the hip. It happens through the whole system. So just to keep it very easy today, we'll call this the X factor because it's dead easy, I hope. I think it's a story that we all know, and we're kind of looking at. So the actual amount of separation. So let's keep it fairly chilled this morning because I know it's still early morning on day 2, so this is when we can get a bit tired. So we'll talk about the kind of the pelvis, lumbar spine separation from the kind of upper rib cage. So we'll discuss that kind of separation that way. How much you separate, how big that separation is, it's of influence, but actually not that influential. So the idea of having tremendous separations, yes, it's of help, of course it is, because you can really kind of lengthen elasticity in that system quite well. But it's actually not important, it's just not as important as different parts of that story. How fast you create that separation is significantly important. So it's not so much how much separation can we produce, it's how quickly can we produce that separation. So the rate of stretch, how fast you separate. And that goes into lead arm, which we'll look at perhaps after a 2-minute break in a second. The speed of separation is the absolute queen and king of the X Factor story. And then the final add-on then becomes the closure rate, the time it takes to then return to the pre-stretch value. So once you've got that separation, the time it takes to that rib cage then to then catch up and return to the pre-separation value. So the idea of kind of how much, how fast, how quick can it return. The absolute priority in that story is the speed, the rate of separation, how quickly you separate, and that really goes back to how fast the brain sends signals, which then excites the neurons and the fibers in the muscle to then really go very fast. So you could have a very long, slow stretch, and the tissues just aren't that really excited that much. They will just close very slowly. It's a bit like the very famous Bruce Lee 1-inch punch, that some of you may know. You've seen the famous Bruce Lee 1-inch punch. There's not a tremendous amount of X factor, but it's a very, very high stretch closure rate. Just stand up and then we'll have a little break after this, and we'll finish off those 3 after 2 minutes. I didn't realize how much the Finns like caffeine yesterday. It's a big thing. Yeah, I established that I asked for a decaf coffee, and the guy went, "What? Go home, boy." Yeah. Never come back. No. Just start to play with this, that the idea of that separation, but then how quickly, how fast can you separate that? Very explosive. Hey, Mate's good, Luis. Really, I mean, almost like how hard can you hit someone with that left hip? Give that, if there's one of your best friends there, how hard can you whack them with that left hip in transition? Remember, it's got to go laterally as well. Up in left, that's it. Off the scale fast. Yes, sir. Ah, brilliant. What a great question. Can I just pause that for 30 seconds? Yeah. And I'll answer that because that's a very good question. Very relevant question, actually, to what we saw with the guys back in March, Hank, at the national program, because that came up a few times. Different kind of feeling. It's not so much how much, it's just how quickly you do it. See, this whole thread hopefully starts to connect up now. The movement on that right big toe, the compression to that big toe, the elevation of the pelvis, how quickly it happens. So these aren't independent movements. It's a story just told independently. It's hopefully the way I try and kind of discuss this. You know when we said do it quickly? Right. That's my definition of fast. I played, just before lockdown, I played at home. I'm just getting so slow. It's just disturbingly bad. And I thought I was a pretty good mover, but clearly not. Just sit down once again, guys. And I've got to ask a very good question there, actually. And I'll show you this, because I've just done a little tutorial on this. So if you can allow me to find this, I'll show the data. God, what was his name? Oh, this is old ages, Hank. You forget names. Yeah, right. So I was doing some research. I'm in the middle of a research project currently on distance. So I was capturing their TrackMan 7-iron speed. So you can kind of see 94 to 97. So pretty good for 7-iron. That's okay. I mean, that will compete. So good player, this guy. He was an international amateur, just turned pro. So, decent player. Which one was it did we use? Let's try this one. Great, right. And I'll show you it this way. So let's just kind of shorten the sequence for you. So just to ask a really good question there, that when Rory first became really kind of known globally, around about 2008, just after the Walker Cup, which is, do most of you guys know the Walker Cup? It's the kind of GB&I versus the US. It's the kind of amateur Ryder Cup. It's a big event for the amateurs back home. So obviously it's 2007, played Walker Cup, played the Open Championship, but 2008 is when he got his card, I think, and really became globally known. And he had this movement that, we've never seen this before, that post-impact, how his pelvis actually recoils and then closes, actually clockwise or rotates clockwise post-impact. To which my response was, you may have not seen it before, it doesn't mean it's not happened before. You've just never been exposed to it. So just because you've not seen it doesn't mean it's not happened for 1,000 years or 100 years. It may just be the first time that you've seen it and you've captured it, which is very different. That's often where I kind of smile with some of these revelations. We've got this player, it's first guy ever to move this way. Well, hang on a second, it might just be the first time you've actually seen it. So what you know versus what the world knows can be very different. So these movements have happened since day one, I can assure you of that, in a good way, where that post-impact, how the rib pelvis actually starts to then clockwise rotate post-impact. I'll actually show this because he reminded me of a guy here. So the red arrow is the pelvis rotation. The green arrow is the rib cage rotation, and the yellow arrow being the rotation of the head. Just kind of watch how that red arrow behaves just post-impact. So we'll do that once again. Around about now, it gets actually pulled back into a clockwise direction as it then kind of stalls and then rotates. These movements have been around since day one, but golf's great at that. Selling, just because that's the first time they've seen it, doesn't mean it's not happened in 1,000 years of golf, but it's a different discussion. So really why that happens is when you've got this guy who's at best 20, maybe even 18, 19, when you've got very powerful 97 mile an hour, 7-iron, which is pretty impressive, that's going to compete on any level. Very powerful, wonderful elasticity, but still at that, what you call the growth plates, don't really fuse until about 2021. So when all those joints get nicely kind of robust and nice and controlled, it doesn't really happen to you about early 20s. You've got these wonderfully powerful movers with exceptionally mobile segments. The muscles that rotate the pelvis and the rib cage that kind of run through here, they almost kind of get to that maximum length. And the closure rate, the recoil then, is so powerful, it just pulls the pelvis back. So it's a physiological response, often seen in very powerful players, which are extremely mobile and often haven't quite yet got that wonderful developed skeletal frame. Hence Rory at, what have been in 19 then perhaps, off the scale quick, so powerful, not quite yet fully matured skeletally. I mean, wonderful pelvis movement like this guy, just the muscles shortening and closing, just pulls that pelvis back again because the muscles that rotate the pelvis and the rib cage kind of run all through here. It's just them closing very fast. So this great phenomenon, as it was described, is just a physiological response in very powerful, young, advanced, established players, really. So I'd really kind of leave you, that's such a great question, so thank you for that. I'd leave you with that thought, just because they've not seen it doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means that whoever captures the data that day, it might be the first time for them, but it's not the first time for the rest of us. So just a nice animation way of seeing that. So that would be a very powerful recoil. How much, how fast, the recoil rate of just off the scale quick recoil. I can even look at the data there. So you've got me on a blind question now, which is always good in a live audience. Yeah, I'll come on to that in a second. Very, very good recoil. Just as an add-on, actually, just before we, because it kind of feeds into the next question. Everyone all okay and ready for the push on to luncheon? Good. Going back to those two players who talked about the lateral separation, I'll go through in a second why I've kind of displayed this. Oh, sorry, I'm getting to that time of day myself, and I'm going to digress. Patsy asked me a very nice question around, I just said golf at the moment, certainly for me, it's almost a daily battle, but it's not, because I kind of gave up on this stuff a long time ago. I mean, science has almost been replaced in some ways now by social media, unfortunately. It's just golf and whatever, it's just the way it is. And I spoke at a coaching conference. It was done remotely in the end on Monday and Tuesday this week. It was a US event, but we had to obviously not do it live because of the current situation. And there was a Q&A at the end of the session. And almost all the speakers on screen, and almost every session came back to, how do I increase my social media presence? I thought this is neat. We're at a coaching conference, and we're hopefully trying to educate people. And the biggest thing that people want to learn these days is, how do I get more presence in online content? I'm thinking, what chance do we have? But there you go. It's just where it's at. So if you've got a lot of followers, it's a good thing. I thought, well, there's been a lot of dictators in life. Had many followers, and look how that ended up. So that's not a good validation, having many followers. So, yeah. But that's just what they ask. How do I get social media presence now? But hey-ho, there you go. Anyway, so back to these two players, the powerful one on the left and the less so. All right, so we mentioned that lateral separation, which is very much part of that X Factor story. How much can we actually get that the hands and pelvis, they don't move this way, but essentially increasing that separation, that way in transition. Yes, sir. Width. Yeah. Good observation, though. So the width between the pelvis and the hands. So I would take them to top of backswing. So how much separation? This is in centimeters for those that are also curious. So we move the one on the left in transition. The peak separation, the peak value they produce is about 15 centimeters of separation laterally between the pelvis and the hand in transition. Whereas on the left-hand side, this particular player, it gets into the 20s. So significant, 25, whatever, significant increase in how much separation they get that way. So it's another contributor to why some people are more powerful than others. Okay. So one area really had a lot of attention, it was almost 2019 thing. Curious in a nice way, and I'll be hoping it could be what 2021's big thing will be, so who knows yet. But it was the kind of big one really last year now, was around the idea of adduction. So there's actually two types of adduction. There's what you call vertical AB, abduction, and horizontal AB, or abduction and adduction. So adduction is actually two directions. You can ab and adduct the arm this way. You can AB, ab, and adduct the arm this way. So this is horizontal adduction. The concept of it in transition, how the rib cage rotates independently away from, or into, that lead arm. So when you look at adduction, the idea that lead arm compressing, what it isn't, is the lead arm compressing onto that rib cage. That kind of connects back to then often that lead elbow moving a long way behind us. Sorry, 1 second. How it's achieved is more through the rib cage moving and rotating independently into that lead arm. Another big contributor to how much adduction we produce is also that lateral separation. So some of you may have experienced that. When we had that kind of hand-pelvis separation, I felt some activity through that lead shoulder. So there's a bit of combination of those kind of two movements. And we'll stand up shortly and play with this once again whilst I sort my headset out, because it's got in a funny position. But how much lateral separation can we produce as that rib cage moves into that lead shoulder? So what it isn't is compressing the arm, something very, very different. The idea of compression versus connection again, elbow behind us, these hopefully nice threads that we now see. It's more, can we rotate that rib cage independently? So if everyone just stands up once again. That's better, right. And just start to explore that how much can I move the rib cage or rotate the rib cage in this direction anti-clockwise without the hands moving. I'm only looking for probably less than even, 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees. It's not like there's going to be huge amounts of separation as we can often achieve, through the pelvis. More caffeine next time. So on this next one, again, let's just play with this approach now. As you start down, just compress the lead arm. Does that give you a very different, and provide a very different level of awareness then? So I'm hopeful in a good way that just provides a very, very different experience perhaps to adduction. Interestingly, with these two players, thank you, by the way, you can sit down there, so thank you for that. Again, interestingly with these two players, if you can hopefully see left-hand column, third one down, called thorax lead arm separation. It's the thorax lead arm stretch. So it's actually a lot less for the player on the left and one on the right-hand side. But again, the amount of separation, it's important, but it's not vital. But if we look beneath that, we have something called thorax, lead arm stretch, thorax, lead arm recoil. That's the speed the stretch happens at. And then the closure rate, how quickly that lead arm, once compressed, comes off the rib cage. Doesn't then stay on there and stay on there and stay on there as it can be in some of the younger, more kind of developing adolescent players. Often it goes back to that great concept that kind of almost going into your story, which I really love that question there, that we've all been, their pelvis is too quick through impact. I mean, there's simply no such thing ever. It's more that the rib cage and the arms aren't quick enough to catch up. So why would we ever slow down something which makes them so good? And we've all been exposed to, this player's pelvis is way too fast at impact. Well, no, it's just the arms and the rib cage aren't quick enough to catch them up. So why would you slow down the good segment to accommodate the ones that aren't working well enough? And so I think we've all probably had that kind of experience and exposure. Certainly I was in my younger days, that Mark, your pelvis is too quick. Okay. So you look at the rate, how much quicker that separation happens at, and then how much more explosive, how much more elastically that the arm then comes away from that rib cage. So we can sit down this one, I won't get you to do this, but you can start to play it once it's compressed, how quickly the arm then comes away again, starts to actually, we've got AB, abduct away. So again, that kind of story, the adduction is part of the story. A much bigger story is how fast that happens, how it's actually produced, and then how quickly it comes off again. And it's another reason why you often see younger players, and I'll show a pretty sad video in a second as we move towards the kind of post-lunch around a young lady, particularly really nice girl, who had that experience, your pelvis is too quick, so therefore they're so active through the hands and arms. So if you look at the joint in the middle, it's the arm. So it's not so much the pelvis is too fast, the hands are too overactive. It's what's in between isn't providing that nice match, which is the arm's not moving quick enough. Okay, right, last couple, and then we can go in a very different direction. I can put the data away for a bit, so you'll be pleased to know there'll be no more plots to look at. I mean, yeah, we can look at that also. Another big influence is how fast you rotate. It's actually, I'm just doing an actual research project currently to which these players have actually been contributors to. And the actual how fast you rotate, the rotational speeds now, appear to be less of an influence. They're important, so how fast you rotate still is pretty important, how quickly those segments are rotating. But what's becoming evident is what's more important is the speed gain. So the actual change in speed, or the gain in speed between paired segments. How fast does the rib cage rotate relative to the pelvis? How fast does the lead arm rotate relative to the rib cage? How quick does the lead hand rotate relative to the arm? So the gain, the change in speed between the segments appears to be of much more value. And I'll explain why in a second. So we now go back to the data momentarily. So it's in each window, it's the third column down on the left. If you look at all the kind of movements we have, all the data we have, all the values that we can really export and be exposed to, perhaps the most revealing one on really how elastic, how well the human's moving, just how well we move. In some ways, it's like the basketball, how high they jump, the sprinters, how fast they run, the gait, like we discussed. There's all these comparables we can use with different sports. The one in golf is that speed gain value. How well are we at moving speed through our system? How elastic, how good are we at moving speed through our whole body? That wonderful mechanical spring that we are as human beings. So you look at the short play on the right-hand side. Initially, the speed gain, pelvis to thorax, 36 degrees. There's actually not a tremendous increase in that rib cage rotation relative to the pelvis, whereas the guy on the left-hand side, 140, so tremendous increase in that rib cage past the pelvis. So really how good are they at moving energy through their system, how elastic are they then once the pelvis has gone, allowing that rib cage to move past it. Equally so, we then look at the arm, the thorax, how quickly does that arm then come away from that rib cage? What's it, 149 on the slow player? I mean, almost 3 times that value on the very fast player. So the speed gains, when we look at the rotational speed of the segments, they're not as important. What's a lot more important is the gain in speed across every segment. Can each segment, and this is the important bit now if you look at this, actually increase at a greater rate than the one it precedes? So you look at the powerful player, the thorax to lead arm value is a much greater value than the thorax to pelvis. Equally so, the lead arm to the lead hand value is again much greater still. So each segment increases at a greater rate than the ones it precedes. That wonderful kind of mechanical spring. So that's very much the important bit, David, more for you to look at. Again, apologies, guys, one sec. This is got really pickled at the back. Upside down. That's better. What you look at very much, we said yesterday, David, is that it's not so much how fast they rotate, is it going quicker at a much higher rate than the ones it precedes. So very, very important, that. Very, very important. Essentially, just learn to throw it very well. So we're hoping now start seeing some nice training threads that maybe you know, Pastor, you and I were discussing about kind of themes we saw perhaps back in March with the national ladies in particular. Can you just stand well? Can you walk well? Can you jump? Can you throw? Okay, it's a bit of a, most of it goes back to what we hopefully did when we were, nothing's new, it's just going back to being a 5-year-old again.